It's a project of the Ink Kitchen, which is an online resource, and we stir the pot for decorators and garment people to work together and learn from each other. And we're sponsored by the show, Impression Show, who are wanting to bring more positive experiences to people that come, besides them just coming to get sold things. And we're generously sponsored by Hanes and Hirsch. And I got my friend here, Tony Palmer, who is an international consultant and a longtime water-based printer. We're going to talk about some practical, not theoretical, ideas about how you run water-based on textiles in your shop. Take it away, Tony.
Just to sort of like a little bit about me is that I started printing in 1987. At that time, everything was water-based. It was the norm, and there was a new ink coming across, which was called Plastisol, which we thought, what is this? This will never catch on. This is no good. Eventually, when we realized that Plastisol was, wow, this is easy, we sort of like went away from water-based and moved everything back to Plastisol. We liked the fact that water-based had a soft feel, but what it lacked was opacity. It just wasn't bright. So we had a rule of sort of white shirts was water-based, black shirts was Plastisol. It was multiple hits, low mesh counts. It felt like a Kevlar vest, but it did the job. Eventually we got better at Plastisol, it got smoother, it got softer, and water-based sort of went to the background a little bit. And only the fashion printers were using water-based. Discharge came along.
Is this in the UK or
this is mainly
the EU even?
Mainly in the UK. I found it a lot. The American side were really pushing the Plastisol.
Right.
So we didn't know how to use Plastisol. One of my first jobs was like a Winnie the Pooh job, which it came across from an American customer. They supplied the films and the screens and everything. We're like, what's this?
No, I remember we did a show actually in Lyon in FESPA, and we were printing on the MHM presses, and we were using Plastisol, and I mean, we literally would have like 200 people around the press watching the shirts be printed because people were not used to Plastisol at that time. It was way more prevalent in the U.S. to begin with.
It was a new thing for us. So a typical water-based job for us, if we had a red background and we wanted a cartoon image on the front, we would take a white square and print the red background and then try and match that red background to the red fabric of the sleeves. It was the only way we could get a soft feel on a children's garment, and we got the bright colours, obviously, because we were always printing on white. The challenge came when we needed to print onto dark fabric, and the challenge came when we needed to print onto performance fabric. So water-based, it was the norm, and it just slid into the background. Once it slid into the background, Plastisol became prevalent.
Right.
And all of a sudden, it's awful to say, but we became a little bit lazy. We forgot that you had to clean up every night. We would turn the press off at 5 o'clock and go to the pub. Go home. And it was easy. We'd come in the next day, and we'd just turn the press on and press start. This is like heaven. In the early days, I worked for a fashion brand for Marks and Spencer's in the UK, and we would have 10, 12, 14 colour jobs, and you'd run them all day, and at 15 minutes before home time, you really did get to find out who your friends were, because if you had to wash all those colours up on your own, you were not going home on time. So it would be a joint effort that whoever finished first would jump onto the next press, and they'd clean down and clean down and clean down. You had maybe 30 squeegees to wash. And so it was hard work.
So once it was Plastisol, you didn't need to have any friends?
When it became Plastisol, you were out the door at 5 o'clock. That was it. It's finished. And yeah, it didn't matter. 14 colour job, 2 colour job, doesn't matter. So it became really easy to use Plastisol. We adapted to it so well, thinking, oh, this is great. This is easy now. Obviously, it had its drawbacks. We didn't understand the mesh counts. I know the metric would be a 10 TT. We would throw the mesh, the ink through. That's an equivalent of a 30 over here.
Right.
And we were getting bright colours because we were putting nearly $2 worth of ink on a shirt. But once we fine-tuned it and we got it working, Plastisol works really well, and you'll find that in most shops now, Plastisol is the first choice. It's the easiest choice. If you start printing, you usually start with Plastisol. It doesn't require the discipline that water-based brings. And the question I get asked a lot is, how do you print water-based? But it's actually not as scary as you think. It just requires a little bit of maintenance. To me, it's normal maintenance because that's how I started. But to a Plastisol printer, it's like, oh my God, I can't go home at 5. I have to wait 5:15.
Right. So what are the biggest changes then if you're going to get into water-based, and what's the easiest way to do that without having to change every last thing in your shop?
So one of the things that became popular over the last 10 or 15 years in the UK has been a discharge base with Plastisol on top. So the discharge base with the Plastisol on top was a great cheat because it allowed us to give a soft feel. We had one water-based screen in there that we had to worry about, and all the rest were Plastisol. So we sort of had the best of both worlds. We had the soft feel, we had the bright opaque colours, but we only had one screen to clean down. That's a good introduction in handling a water-based job, right, and not having 10 or 12 colours to worry about blocking and locking in the screens. I'm going back quite a long time.
Yeah, so with discharge, I know one of the big things is people have trouble making screens. So do you have advice on different companies that you think have a decent emulsion?
A decent emulsion. Okay, I ask this question a lot. So people say to me, what's your favorite emulsion? What's the best ink? What's the best squeegee? And I usually answer with, what's your best flavor of potato chips?
None.
and everybody gives a different answer because they have one that fits them.
Right.
I recommended an emulsion to a friend of mine because I was doing 10,000 prints out of it without post-hardening. It was getting no breakdown, water-based discharge. It was superb. He put it into his shop. It lasted 100. It broke down, and he doesn't speak to me anymore.
Right. So it's part of your methods, and
it's what works for you. There is no best. It's what works for you.
I guess my advice usually is to find a supplier that you actually trust. That's not going to BS you. So, and then they'll work with you to get something that works.
The best thing is to find a product that works in your environment. That's your humidity, your method of degreasing, your method of coating, your mesh type. Everything works for you. It's quite individual. Screen printing is a little bit hit and miss. There isn't a golden set of rules that you can stick to and say, right, this works.
Especially because they think there's so many methods to accomplish the same thing. So some people I know print with relatively low tension, some have high tension. You can't just change the tension in your shop. You probably screw everything up.
Yes.
So I think the other thing that people find difficult is the drying in the screen. So what kind of tricks and methods and things that have you seen in your shops that you go into that work well to keep the ink from drying in the screen? Some of that I know is a technique. Some of it's can be misters, all kinds of things. What kind of things work to make it the easiest possible?
So in the UK, we're fortunate not to have really sort of adverse heat or humidity.
No deserts in the UK.
Yeah, no, there aren't. No. So we have a fairly stable climate, so the drying in, the locking in the screen is an issue, but it's not as big an issue as some of the hot countries. That being said, there are retarders that you can put in the ink. When ink blocks in a screen, it is the water evaporating, leaving behind the residue of the ink and the colour.
Right.
So it's the evaporation process. It's heat. It's drying out. I often refer to the coffee cup stain. So if you get a coffee cup and you put it on the worktop and there is a small amount of coffee there, it leaves a ring, and within 2 minutes it becomes a stain. It dries out and becomes solid. Whereas if you spill coffee on the worktop, you can come back in an hour and it'll still be wet because there's a bigger area of water, of liquid.
Right.
And so the one sort of, it's not even a trick or a secret. It's the flood. Just the key to water-based lasting a long time in the screen is the flood. We have to give the screen a blanket of ink. Some call it a gasket. I like the term blanket. We keep a good blanket of ink of around about 1/4 of an inch. If we can get 1/4 of an inch of wet ink on top of a stencil, it's not going to dry out.
Right.
Because the water's going to take so long to evaporate. I've left the screen I did a test. I didn't do a test. I forgot to clean the screen.
Yeah, well, it became a test. Sounds better that it was a test than that you forgot. So how long?
Overnight. I left it overnight.
And it's still printed.
I came in the next morning and I looked at the screen and I went, oh, did I really run to the pub, run home that quickly that I forgot to clean the screen out? So I thought, well, just as a test, I'll do a print. The first print was blocked. It was horrible.
Right.
So, well, my ink company said, this will re-wet, it will reprint. Let's test them. So I did another print, and I could see it start to break down. So I did another print, and now I'm seeing clear images in the mesh. It's still blocked in, but in short, it took about 8 strokes. So after 8 strokes, this mesh was now clear and printable again.
Because you had a pretty thick layer.
I left it nearly 1/2 inch thick.
Right.
But now I'm not recommending to leave ink in the screen overnight.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, when you can control
it shows that you can. It's not like in 5 minutes you're done for.
Trust me, in the early days when the ink had no retarders in it and had white components in it, you went like that, it dried in straight away. The modern inks that we use today, they're used by big corporations, huge sportswear corporations, and they demand a usability.
Right.
If it was bad, their production would fail, they would lose money. So the ink companies are duty-bound to make a good product. And once they have that good product, you may as well take advantage of it and use it yourself.
No, I think there's a lot of printers that used water-based ink in some project a long time ago and had a hard time like that, and they're afraid of it, or they heard of somebody else. It's like impossible to print, and I think it's just not. One thing is it's just not that hard to print anymore. I know we used to use put more retarder in, but one thing affects something else, then you have to have a longer dryer time.
Yeah.
So
you put in the sort of the oil and the main liquid component. You're putting more of that into the ink. And during the drying process, you have to force that out. So the more you put in, the more you have to force out. And water-based curing is about, it's not about hitting a temperature. Plastisol is a lovely 160, 320 F temperature where the chemical component, it hits the heat and it locks.
Right.
Water-based, first of all, we have to remove the water.
Right, all the water has to evaporate.
We have to get that out of there, and then the crosslinks happen.
Right.
But first of all, we have to get the water out. So how long does that take? Well, on a 12-inch by 12-inch print, it takes longer than a 1-inch by 1-inch print.
Right.
It's surface area of water.
So when you go around doing consulting, what kinds of things often make the biggest difference? When you come in and people are like, oh my God, that's so helpful. What type of things, if they were having difficulty printing water-based, allow them to have an easier time?
It's the one thing that I find really helps is an expensive thing. It's labor. So the average press has now worked its way down to 3 operators. Somebody pulling shirts, somebody loading, somebody catching at the end of the dryer.
Right.
And that leaves all the screens just open, because on Plastisol, we would load up a gallon of ink and we'd come back to it in 1,000 prints.
Right.
And we'd see it's still got a gallon of ink in there, so we'd come back to it in another 1,000 prints.
Right.
The early days when I started, the press operator had to perform the milk round, if you like, and walk round, start at the base, scrape the ink in, turn it over, go to the next screen, turn it over.
Right.
By the time you've done 12, the first screen needs doing again.
Right.
And so it's an extra labor, an extra job. I have seen a place over in Jordan where they employed one guy to stand in front of each screen. So they had 6 guys on this 6-color job, and their only job was to do this with a scraper card and make sure that
I don't think that's going to fly here.
That's not going to work here, but you
but
understand.
Maybe somebody else, yes. A little more labor.
Well, to be fair, wing flood bars would have probably replaced that.
Yeah, right.
So wing flood bars help to keep the ink moving and keep it turning around. When we're printing with water-based, especially when we apply heat, at the front of the screen, the sort of like the 4 inches in between the flood bar and the squeegee, that gets hot, it gets dry, and it does tend to get a little bit stiff. So I found that a water bottle or a wet cloth on that, reducing that, also helps to stop the ink drying and start that process.
I think I saw Andy the other day put beer in.
Beer? I put coffee in, but it was a mistake.
He actually was printing posters and did add beer to the ink, and it worked. I saw it.
That's a great idea. No, it's a bad idea. That's a waste of beer.
The beer's in these posters here.
All right, it's okay then.
It's like water. It's like water. So maybe we'll let some questions. Who has questions about water-based printing? No? Okay. Everybody knows everything?
Everybody's really good at it, yeah. The main fear, I think, well, it's a fear with water-based printing. You're so happy with plastisol, and there are enough problems in the production area without introducing another one.
Yeah.
And some of my advice is, if you're in a multi-press shop, dedicate one press. Try that. Just dedicate one press to water-based and see how you go. And the number one thing is speak to your ink rep. They know more about the ink than you do, and they will tell you everything you need to know about the ink. And if they tell you wrong, bring them back in and sell them again.
And if they tell you wrong again, then get a new rep.
Yeah. The inks are completely different.
So the question was, the comment was that the inks have evolved greatly.
The original old school water-based had no opacity. It just simply had no opacity. Like I said, we had to print the red background. Now, with the introduction of high solid acrylics and all the new range of high mesh inks, we have chemical compounds that are capable of being opaque on a polyester shirt printed through a high mesh. That evolution has come from the demand. The sportswear manufacturers demanded it. They want the bright shirt. They don't want the nasty chemicals, and they need the opacity. And
there are changes you can make sometimes. I mean, so to get opacity, rather than use very low mesh counts, we use 3 screens where we would use 2 on a plastisol. Yeah. So we'll hit, we're using a water-based white for shirts 3 times. The great thing is, ironically, 3 screens can make a thinner coat of ink than 1 screen. I mean, think about it if you tried to paint a wall in your house and you tried, to go from a green wall to a white wall, and you could only do it with 1 coat. It would be this sloppy, horrible, thick mess. And when you do multiple coats, so 3 screens on a dark shirt actually makes a thinner coat, especially if you have a good precision press. Tony and I mostly run OHMs. They're great for being, parallel and flat, and you never have to level your palettes. So you can make 3 nice thin coats of ink, and that will, in the end, be a softer shirt, but still get the opacity.
Yeah, because we're drying it in between, we're creating a good base to sit on. So once we create the good base, we then hit another layer. That layer is adding to the opacity. It's still not strong enough, and then that final layer is so fine, but it just makes the difference between not being opaque and opaque. Now it is an extra screen, it's an extra cost. What screens?
What screens do you use? This is the question.
What's the best screen, dear? So the screen selection and the mesh selection is one part of this industry that's still a skill. We can have automatic coating machines, we can have automatic developing machines, reclaiming machines, we've got automatic registration. So we've got all these things that are helping us. But what we're left with is we're still left with a skill of a printer, of a technician, looking at a design, taking into all the factors of opacity, complexity, detail, the shirt substrate, the ink type, and then making a mesh selection. So there is a broad range of guidelines, but there is no magic number. It's whatever works according to all these different variables.
Plus, printing's a system, so, you know.
Would you say that
With Autobeast, do you need a more open screen? Not necessarily.
No. Again, depending on everything we need. Because the inks now have the opacity of plastisol, and they do, some of the HSA whites that I've been using, they have the opacity of plastisol. So which means instead of using 3 or 4 screens like we had before, we can achieve it with 2. And we trade off feel and opacity with detail and soft feel. So the higher the mesh count, the softer the feel. So is feel important to you? If it is, higher your mesh count. If feel isn't, but opacity is, lower the mesh count. But you will still have another set of tools in our arsenal that we can use to counteract the lower mesh counts. So we can reduce the pressure, we can put a harder blade on there, we can straighten the angle, we can speed it up. So although we have a low mesh count, we've got another set of variables that we can control to put less ink down. Or push less ink into the fabric. With water-based, we've got to sit it on the top. Sometimes plastisol looks really good as we force it down and into the fabrics. Water-based looks best and feels best when we sit it on the top.
All right. Tony's going to be around here for a couple minutes maybe, and then over at the SPSI booth if you want to ask him more questions. He's pretty approachable. I've only seen him bite people a couple of times. And so thanks a lot, Tony.
All right.